Hello and welcome to the History Crew. This is part 2 in the series, so please make sure you have watched part 1 in order to get a better understanding of this topic, which is the coming of democracy in South Africa. And so, as I explained in part 1, there were a lot of issues to deal with in order for negotiations to begin. But they did get the ball rolling with the release of Mandela in 1990. Even then, there were still more issues to deal with that was not going to make this process of negotiations any more simple. Firstly, the ANC had been banned for 30 years, and the ANC leadership themselves had no experience on how to govern the country. The ANC had to transform itself from a liberation movement to a political party. Secondly, there was the issue amongst ANC members if the armed struggle should stop or continue. Some members were in favor of MK to continue their operations within South Africa, whilst others wanted MK to halt their actions. Besides that, there were internal problems between the ANC members itself, as there were possible clashes between those who stayed in SA, the leadership within the country, and the returning exiles as to who should lead the ANC. The National Party, under the leadership of F.W. de Klerk, also had its own issues. The NP began losing support as some whites joined other parties, such as the AWB and the Conservative Party, which would become known as the right wing. The issue was that some conservative whites were not in favor of the negotiation process and started losing faith in the National Party and thus joined the new emerging right wing parties. There was also the problem of members in the army and the police who allegedly supported the right wing because they were against negotiations with the ANC. Besides poverty, unemployment, etc., there were further complications by the increasing violence between supporters of Inkatha and the ANC, where migrant workers living in hostels clashed with township residents. Many people believed that a third force of security force personnel was encouraging this violence. But perhaps the most difficult of all were the expectations of the millions of people in the townships who had participated in the resistance of the 1980s and were now impatient for change. So, as I've just explained, sitting down and negotiating for a new South Africa was not simple. There were many more problems which the leaders had to overcome in order to achieve success in the negotiation process. And thus, it is critical for you to understand and explain that the period between 1990 to 1994 was characterized by intense negotiations, sustained violence, and compromise, and finally only they were able to achieve a settlement. It was not an easy process. It was not an easy period of negotiating, and you must understand that, and you must be able to explain that in your essay. However, you must also be able to explain how compromise between leaders eventually led to a settlement in 1994. So plans to begin negotiations was actually postponed from the onset due to violence in Sebokeng, where people protested against local rent councils. This was one of the big issues still being carried over from the 1980s. In this protest action, many people were killed, but the talks were saved because Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk met secretly to keep the process going. This is already showing compromise between two important leaders for the sake of peace, for the sake of the country. So, despite this early challenge, ANC and NP delegations conducted a set of meetings. These were not official negotiations to immediately start changing the country. Instead, These discussions became known as the talks about talks. The first round of talks was conducted on 2nd May 1990 when an ANC delegation met with the National Party delegation at Grotesque Ear, as you can see in the first picture. This became known as the Grotesque Ear Minute, and it was important because both sides committed themselves to end violence and work towards negotiations. Now you must understand that at this Grotesque Ear meeting, this was the first ever kind of meeting where a large group of ANC members met a large group of the National Party. They were once enemies, and they were now going to sit down across a table and look each other in the eye and discuss and talk about the way forward. De Klerk at this meeting announced that temporary immunity would be given to returning exiles and also allowing for normal political activity to be undertaken. So already you can see for yourself that there is compromise coming from one side in order for the sake of a more prosperous and positive negotiation process. There was also the discussion on the difference between political prisoners and convicted criminals. This meeting lasted for about 4 hours and concluded with a much more social dinner. So, as I explained to you, these were not official negotiations regarding the process to change South Africa. They are meeting each other for the first time ever. The second meeting took place a few months later, in August 1990, the same year, at Pretoria. This became known as the Praetorium Minute. However, the delegations were not as large as the first one, and Mandela and de Klerk just had a few advisors each. An important compromise here came from Mandela this time, where he announced the end of the armed struggle. These are already positives in order to move the negotiation process forward. And so this brings us to the conclusion of part two. However, there are some key aspects you must take note of. Firstly, there are many issues to contend with. The ANC had to change from being a liberation movement to a political party. Its leaders had no experience of governing a country. Then there was internal conflict with the ANC themselves. The National Party was also losing support and membership. Then there was the growing threat of the right wing in the country. Besides all of that, there were huge problems of poverty, unemployment, and dealing with the expectations of black people. Even before talks could begin, the violence in Sebokeng threatened to end everything before it began. However, there were talks, friendly talks. The first to take place occurred in Grotesque Ear, and a few months later in Pretoria. Thank you. This brings us to the conclusion of part 2. Please remember that you are required to also read and investigate, and this video will just help build on what you already know.